Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. One of the more fascinating matchups we're going to see on Saturday. Michigan heading on the road, playing the Washington Huskies. Not only a rematch of what we saw in the national championship last year, but I think more importantly, not a lot of people understanding that although Michigan is a top 10 ranked team in the country heading on the road here, they're going to be underdogs in this football game. And I think that starts with just giving Washington a ton of respect for how good this football team is, much better than what their record says. Right, sitting with a 3-2 record, that's obviously not going to jump out at the paper at you. But you look into those two losses, Washington State, Rutgers, in both of those football games, and Washington outgained their opponents, just weren't able to make the plays to win those games. This is a really good Washington team with an elite secondary, a much better front seven than I thought they would have going into 2024 in an offense that, although is outside the top 70 in points per game, is top 20 in yards per play. This is a Washington offense that's had no problem moving the football on opposing defenses, but when they get into the red zone, that's when some of the problems happen. This is a really good Washington team. Want to get into, kind of a deep dive into this football game, talk about how Michigan can go on the road and pull this upset off. Now, before we get into it, as always, and most importantly, whether you're a Washington fan, whether you're a Michigan fan, let it fly in the comment section. I think this matchup is fascinating. We're going to dive into some particular players and key matchups in this football game. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions. Of course, if you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. That goes a long way in helping the boys out. And without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start unpacking the matchup we're going to see with this Washington offense going up against a very good Michigan defense. I think this is the most fascinating matchup that we're going to see on the football field. Look, this Washington offense, it's multidimensional, can go to a lot of different things to move the football. And I think it starts with you got an elite running back in Jonah Coleman. I think he's probably the most underrated running back that we see in the country. I think you're looking at two really underrated running backs in Kalel Mullings and Jonah Coleman. You look at Jonah Coleman's numbers, absolutely incredible. Is a missed tackles, a forced missed tackles machine. Like, this kid just doesn't really go to the ground, has burst at the second level. Now, you start unpacking how this Washington offense likes to operate. What is the key for Michigan to have success against this Huskies offense? I think it starts with tackling in space. You look at Jed Fish and how he wants to throw the football. We kind of said this heading into 2024. The Jed Fish offense is largely constructed on getting the football out quick, on time to their playmakers and letting them operate in space. You're not going to see this Washington team sit back in the pocket and push the ball down the field vertically all that often. Now, they have that component of their offense, but it's certainly not something that they like to go to all that often. Go back to what Jed Fish did at Arizona, very similar kind of offense, and it fits what Will Rogers wants to do at a high level. Will Rogers isn't he doesn't have a massive arm, doesn't have a high end NFL caliber arm. I think a lot of Washington fans would agree with that. And because of that, Jed Fish is just building this offense around what Will Rogers can do, and that is process and be really accurate in the short, intermediate route trees. Taking a look at Washington's offense, I mean, Will Rogers has thrown for almost 1,400 yards. Over 800 of those yards have come after the catch. What is that telling you? Hey, we're getting the football out quick. We're getting the football out to our playmakers and then letting them excel after the catch. And it's headlined by a former Michigan wide receiver in Giles Jackson. And Giles Jackson has over 200 yards after the catch to start this 2024 season. If you're Michigan, the number one thing you're trying to do is scrunch down on this Washington offense, and you got to make sure you tackle in space. That's something that Michigan last year did an exceptional job of. Guys like Rod Moore, guys like Mikey Sandstrom, they just didn't miss tackles in space. It's been something that has given Michigan some problems early in the 2024 season. You've seen some uncharacteristic missed tackles from guys like Makari Page, guys like Will Johnson. If you are Michigan, the number one thing you are looking to do in this football game is when Washington wants the football out quickly and on time, you got to make sure you're closing in on the ball carriers, and you got to make sure you're making your tackles in space. That's number one. Number two, you look at Will Rogers and how they want to operate in the passing attack. Not only is the ball coming out quickly, it's often going to the middle of the field. You look at the throw chart for Will Rogers, over 50% of his attempts are attacking the middle of the field. I think that has to do with a couple of different things. One, that's where the wide receivers, guys like Giles Jackson, and I'd argue Denzel Boston as well, excel the most. But I think more importantly, Jed Fish knows that Will Rogers, again, doesn't have a massive, massive arm. He definitely is not excelling when he's throwing to the boundary. But when he's working the middle of the field, he's very accurate and he's really good at keeping the football out of harm's way. If you are Michigan, you got to make sure your linebackers are disciplined in terms of trying to take away that middle of the field where Washington likes to operate. And what Washington likes to do is kind of run that RPO where you're show and run, you're sucking in linebackers and then creating that space over the linebackers' heads to attack the middle. It's going to be a really tough balance. This is why Washington's offense, I think, it is really good. Is if you don't respect what Washington can do running the football, Jonah Coleman can hurt you. But if you want to respect too much what Jonah Coleman can do, I mean, Will Rogers can throw it over your head and really attack that middle of the field. So if you're Michigan, what is Wink Martindale doing to take away the middle of the field? If it was personal to me, and again, I ain't no defensive coordinator, I'm not a master of defensive scheme, but I'm taking my safeties and scrunching down that middle of the field, not only relying on my linebackers to take away the middle and zone coverage, but I'm also going to rely on some of my safeties as well because again, you look at the matchup and say, I think Michigan probably feels pretty good about guys like Jair Hill and Will Johnson coming back healthy in terms of sitting on an island and taking away the vertical passing attack. I don't think that's a matchup that favors Washington in this game. I think Will Johnson and Jair Hill can handle themselves with working with wide receivers vertically. And so you now have the ability to walk in your safeties, take away that middle of the field. And if you can do those two things, tackle in space and take away the middle of the field, that is primarily how Washington has had a lot of success moving the football to start the season. Last one, and arguably the biggest storyline. And if you were to ask me what's the most important stat, you don't even need to show me the scoreboard. Just show me what these teams did in the red zone. I could probably tell you who won the football game. Red zone defense. You look at Washington, again, they've had absolutely zero problems moving the football down the field. They are top 20 in yards per play. They're really good on third downs. But when they do get into the red zone for some reason, I'm not really sure. Like, watch it. I don't love some of the, and Jed Fish is way smarter than me in terms of calling an offense, but I mean, running some like corner routes to Giles Jackson, I don't feel like that's using your personnel the best. There's been some problems with what Washington's done in the red zone. They like to go to the true freshman, Demond Williams, in terms of what he can do with his legs as, kind of a wildcat quarterback in a sense. If you're Michigan, you got to make sure you're taking care of business. You probably respect the fact that Washington is probably going to move the football at least a little bit in this football game. But when you get inside your red area, you want to be forcing Washington to kick field goals because that's been a problem. Not only not scoring touchdowns in the red zone, but field goal kicking has been a massive problem for Washington as well. So if you can do those three things on the defensive side of the football, I think that puts you in a position to win this football game. Now, going over to this Michigan offense, I think it starts with misdirection in the run game. And Michigan's going to need to run the football here because you look at the Michigan passing attack, obviously some big time question marks. And then you look at Washington secondary and say 49% completion percentage given up. That's number 3 in the country, only 4.8 yards per pass attempt. That's number 7 in the country. I think we're looking at one of the better secondaries in the country, not only from a personnel standpoint, but I think Coach Belichick's done a phenomenal job coaching up the secondary. I think if you look at this football game, if you're a Michigan fan like myself, you're saying, I don't see Michigan having a ton of success throwing the football. We haven't seen it from this Michigan offense, but then you look at the matchup and say, this is a really good Washington secondary. If you are going to throw the football, it's probably going to Colston Loveland because I think the boundary cornerbacks for Washington are really good. And I think that's a matchup that probably favors Washington. If you want to have success throwing the football, it's probably going to your tight ends, headlined by Colston Loveland. But I think secondly, you got to be able to run the football. In Washington, to give them credit, we had massive question marks about what this front seven would look like, especially moving into the Big Ten. They lost a lot of pieces. They had to fill it in through the transfer portal. And to Washington's credit, I think they did a really good job, right? Sebastian Valdez on the insides played really good football for Washington. Now, how can Michigan get the ground game going? I think it starts with misdirection. And this is something we've talked about a lot. Like Michigan's a one-dimensional offense right now, largely. There's not a ton of confidence that Michigan has throwing the football down the field. We're leaning on the run game with Alex Orji. Now, if you're going to be one-dimensional in terms of the run-pass split, you got to make sure you're multi-dimensional in terms of how you run the football. And you saw Michigan, at least in my opinion, take some strides against Minnesota in terms of how they wanted to run the football. This is a Washington linebacker room that is extremely aggressive. They played one really, really good football, haven't missed a lot of tackles, a lot of run stops. But I think where if you're Michigan, what can you maybe attack is how aggressive they are. Like they want to fire downhill. Can you use Alex Orji? Can you use some jet sweep motions to play with the eyes of these Washington linebackers, get them taking false steps, create a little bit of space in this run game? That's probably what you're looking to do if you're Michigan. Again, if you're not going to throw the football and you're going to be a run heavy offense, you got to make sure you're running the football in a lot of different ways. And I think secondly, you want to stay in the football field. This is a Washington front seven that I think has been good with the starters, but the depth I think we still have question marks about. If you can kind of, it's got a very similar story to Michigan's defensive line. If you can get to the depth, get to that defensive line rotation, I think Michigan can have a lot of success there as well. Those are some of the matchups that I'm looking at. Again, I think this is going to be a very, very competitive football game. It probably comes down to if you're looking at Michigan, one, red zone defense is a priority. And number two, you want to run the football and control the time possession. And if you're Washington, if you can start scoring some touchdowns in the red zone, again, this is a team that should be 5-0. If the red zone offense is just average, they're probably 5-0 football team right now. So those are the matchups I'm looking at. Again, going to be a phenomenal game. We're going to recap it Friday or Saturday night. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.